Title: The Mask of the Red Death. I, the Plague Shadow. The Red Death had long devastated the land. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. The pains of the affliction were sudden, its progress swift, and its end inevitable. The seizure, the dizziness, the profuse bleeding from the pores, and the scarlet stains upon the body marked its victim as beyond salvation. Within half an hour, all hope was extinguished, and the sufferer was cast upon the pile of the dead. Yet, despite the wretched state of the kingdom, Prince Prospero remained unshaken in his belief that he could defy the plague. In the depths of his palace, he and 1,000 of his most favored courtiers retreated to safety. Walls of steel encircled the grand abbey, welded shut, barring the horrors of the world beyond. Inside, an abundance of food, wine, and music nourished the senses, and for months, the world outside was but a forgotten dream. 2. The Fortress of Revelry. Within the abbey, the prince had devised a spectacle of extravagance, a masquerade ball so magnificent that it defied the cruelty of fate itself. The rooms of the grand suite were arranged in an eccentric pattern. 7 vast chambers, each adorned in a single dominant color. The first was blue, its walls, its draperies, its stained glass windows, all reflecting the hue of the sky at dawn. The second chamber was purple, with its regal grandeur deepened by the play of light and shadow. The third chamber was green, vibrant as the fields of spring. The fourth, orange, glowed like a sunset caught in eternal splendor. The fifth, white, radiated the purity of fresh snowfall. The sixth, violet, bathed its occupants in a surreal, spectral glow. The seventh chamber was veiled in black velvet, its only illumination the blood-red light from a stained glass window. Within it stood a massive ebony clock, its chimes deep and sonorous. Each hour, as its sound echoed to the halls, the revelers paused, briefly reminded of the inexorable passage of time. 3. The masquerade begins. The night of the great revelry arrived. The courtiers, adorned in grotesque and elaborate costumes, moved through the chambers in a dreamlike dance. Laughter and music swelled, drowning the darkness that lurked beyond the iron gates. It was an orgy of mirth, a rebellion against despair, a grand illusion that death itself had been vanquished. Yet, as the clock struck midnight, the revelers faltered. A figure had appeared amongst them, a presence neither invited nor known. Unlike the other guests, whose costumes exuded whimsy and grotesquerie, this figure was draped in the garb of the grave. Its mask was the face of a corpse. Its robes, stained with blood, mimicked the very markings of the Red Death. 4. The confrontation. A murmur spread like a rising wind through the hall. The presence of the spectral intruder struck fear even into the heart of Prince Prospero. His expression twisted into rage at the defilement of his sanctuary. With a cry, he demanded the stranger be seized, but no hand dared to touch him. With slow, deliberate steps, the masked figure moved through the chambers, leaving a hush in its wake. Prospero, his fury burning brighter than his fear, drew his dagger and pursued the intruder into the black chamber. As he lifted his weapon, the figure turned to face him. A single gasp escaped the prince's lips before he crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The end of the mask. The revelers, frozen in horror, rushed to subdue the figure. Yet, when they grasped at its robes, they found nothing beneath. The masked entity was no man, but the very essence of the Red Death itself. One by one, the guests fell where they stood, their laughter silenced, their masks slipping from lifeless hands. And so, in the halls of abandoned splendor, the great ebony clock struck its final chime. The flames of the braziers dimmed, the music ceased, and darkness and decay held dominion over all. At Kanchaknapong, R6F.
Title: The Telltale Heart Expanded Adaptation. Chapter 1. The obsession begins. It is true. Yes, I have been nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous. But why do you insist that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not dulled them. Above all, my hearing had become preternaturally acute. I heard all things in heaven and earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Observe how calmly, how precisely I tell you the story. I had no reason to hate the old man. He had never wronged me, had never given me cause for resentment. It was his eye. His pale blue eye, veiled with a film like that of a vulture, that disturbed me. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, little by little, very gradually, I made up my mind to rid myself of the eye forever. Chapter 2. The Watchful Nights. For 7 nights, I crept into his chamber, moving as silently as a shadow. I was patient. Oh, how patient! Each night, I would push open the door ever so gently, thrusting my head in, inch by inch, so slowly that the old man never stirred. And then, with great caution, I would open my lantern, just enough to let a faint ray fall upon his eye. But it was always closed. Always. And so, I could not do the deed. For it was not the old man I despised. It was the vulture eye. And only when it was open, only then could I strike. Chapter 3. The Fatal 8th Night. On the 8th night, I was more cautious than before, taking greater pains to be silent. The hands of the clock moved more sluggishly than ever. Never before had I felt the extent of my own powers, my sagacity. I chuckled softly at my cleverness. But suddenly the old man stirred. Perhaps he heard me. Perhaps his soul sensed my intent. He did not speak, but I could hear his heart begin to pound, a slow, heavy sound that grew louder in the still darkness. He was afraid. I stood motionless, waiting. After some time, I slowly opened the lantern, the tiniest fraction, until the single thin ray fell upon the eye. Open at last, staring blindly into the darkness. A wild fury overtook me then. My blood boiled. The pounding of his heart had grown thunderous, unbearable. With a scream, I leaped into the room, dragging him to the floor. He shrieked once, but only once. I smothered him beneath the weight of the mattress. For long minutes, I remained there listening. The heartbeat had stopped. The old man was dead. Chapter 4. The Concealment. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the careful manner in which I concealed the body. There was no blood, oh no. I had been too cunning for that. I worked swiftly, dismembering the corpse and placing each part beneath the floorboards. I replaced them with such precision that no eye, not even his, could have detected anything amiss. As the night waned, I felt a triumphant glee. The deed was done. No human eye, not even mine, could see the evidence of my crime. Chapter 5. The Visitors. It was still dark when I heard a knocking at the door. Smiled. I had nothing to fear. I opened it to find 3 officers of the law. A neighbor had heard a shriek, they said, and they had come to investigate. I welcomed them in, smiling at their suspicion. The shriek had been my own, I explained. A mere nightmare. The old man was away, I told them, and to prove my innocence, I led them through the house, speaking cheerfully, confidently. At last, I brought them to his chamber. I bade them sit and rest, even offering them chairs directly above the very spot where I had concealed the corpse. I was so at ease, so completely victorious, that I myself fetched a chair and sat atop the very planks beneath which he lay. Chapter 6. The Sound That Would Not Cease. But then it began. A low, dull sound, barely perceptible at first. A soft thudding, rhythmic, persistent. My smile faltered. I spoke more loudly to cover it, but still it grew. My heart pounded in my chest, and yet it was not my own heart I heard. It was his. The old man's heart, beating from beneath the floorboards, louder, ever louder. The officers did not seem to hear it. They continued their idle talk, but I could not bear it. The sound swelled to a deafening roar. It was as if the very walls trembled with its force. My head ached, my vision blurred. Sweat poured from my brow. Still they talked oblivious. Could they not hear it? No, they must. They must. They were mocking me, taunting me with their false ignorance. Chapter 7. The Confession. No more. I shrieked. No more. Villains. Dissemble no longer. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Hear, hear. It is the beating of his hideous heart. I fell to my knees, overcome with horror, my voice lost in the echo of that dreadful sound. The officers sprang forward, tearing back the boards, revealing my terrible crime. And yet, the heartbeat did not cease. Even as they dragged me from the house, even as the dawn broke over the silent streets, I still heard it, thumping, ceaseless, eternal. Epilogue: The price of guilt. Now you ask me why I sit here behind these iron bars in this wretched cell. You ask me if I regret my actions, if I rue the moment I first laid eyes upon that dreadful vulture eye. But how could I regret it? I was justified. I was clever. And yet the sound does not stop. The beating heart echoes still in the walls of my mind, in the pulse of my veins. Louder, louder, always louder. I clutch my ears, but it will not be silenced. The heart beats within me now. And I know, I shall never escape it. At Kanchaknapungar 6F.